Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Dr. Gwendy Reyes-Ilg, board member and director of policy development for the Veterinary Association for Farm Animal Welfare. For those of you unfamiliar with VAFA, our mission is to advocate for animals used in food and fiber production by providing a veterinary perspective grounded in animal welfare science and ethics. We do this through education, policy development, advocacy, and collaborative animal care. VAFA currently has 3 areas of focus. They're preventing and mitigating pain experienced by farm animals, promoting living environments that meet the animal's physical and psychological needs, and ensuring humane end-of-life practices. If you're not yet a member of VAFA but would like to become one, please send us your name through the Q&A box located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or visit www.vafaw.org. Membership is open to anyone who supports our mission, and the first year of membership is free. We are excited to launch the second webinar in our series, Ensuring Humane End-of-Life Practices, with Dr. Jessica Martin speaking to us today about depopulation. Before we get started, I wanted to provide some context for the talk today. As you may know, in the event of a disease outbreak, methods of depopulation are employed on farms. Depopulation refers to the rapid destruction of large numbers of animals in response to an urgent circumstance. Mass depopulation and euthanasia are not synonymous, and depopulation methods do not ensure that the animals face a death free of pain and distress. In the United Kingdom, where Dr. Martin lives and works, legislation governs which methods of depopulation can be used, and the government has invested in developing higher welfare methods that can be rapidly deployed in agricultural settings. During the current outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI, over 104 million chickens, turkeys, and ducks have died or been depopulated in the US. The depopulation methods most commonly used here are ventilation shutdown, or VSD, plus heat, a method that causes death via heat stroke or hyperthermia, and water-based foam, a method that kills via airway occlusion and or drowning. Both of these methods are considered impermissible in the UK and many other countries because of their negative impacts on animal welfare. The USDA reports that VSD plus heat has become the primary depopulation method for commercial egg farms in the US. And based on USDA data, over 82% of birds destroyed due to HPAI died in depopulations in which VSD plus heat was used either as the sole method of depopulation or one of multiple methods used on the same premises. The USDA also reports that in over half the barns in which VSD plus heat is used, some birds survive, and it may in some cases take up to 5 days for those birds to be destroyed via a secondary method. VAFA is committed to decreasing animals' vulnerability to depopulation and to advancing higher welfare methods when depopulation is unavoidable. And after the presentation, I will share with you some details about how you can engage in advocacy efforts on this issue. So we're so fortunate today to have Dr. Jessica Martin, a true expert in the field, speak to us about depopulation. Dr. Martin is an award-winning translational researcher with over a decade of professional experience in the field of animal behavior and welfare in farming, industry, and laboratory environments. As the Elizabeth Creek Associate Professor in Animal Welfare and Innovation at Newcastle University, she chairs the university's Animal Welfare and Ethical Review Body, leading initiatives in ethics and welfare policy. Dr. Martin's research, particularly in controlled atmosphere killing, has positively impacted billions of animals worldwide. After Dr. Martin's presentation, we will follow up with a question and answer session. So throughout the webinar, you're welcome to submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address as many of these questions as time permits. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Martin, and I will turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for the introduction. Right, I will share my screen and hopefully it will all go smoothly. So just sharing it now. So everybody should now hopefully see my presentation. Can somebody just confirm they can see and hear me? Brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me to do this talk and to be the to this event. And I'm delighted to be part of it. And it's a really important issue that I hope will get a lot of discussion and interest with everybody moving forward. So yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about humane endings and navigating the ethical maze of animal welfare in depopulation practices. And I'm going to talk about what happens on in the US, what's going on in the UK and in Europe as well, because there is a lot of sort of overlap and in some cases not, and why that's caused contention and what people need to be aware of. So hopefully most people will already know who are listening to this, but depopulation is defined as the mass killing of a large number of animals, typically occurring in responses to urgent or emergency situations. And this can include infectious disease outbreaks, both natural and made disasters. And depopulation is typically referring to killing all animals that are in a single location, so like a farm. So you have to think about it's not an individual, it's not in a timely way. This is normally in an emergency response situation. And one thing I think is really important to bring up here, because it's a big thing that we have that differentiates between North America and the UK in the EU, is whenever we're talking about an action that involves the intentional killing of an animal, we always use the term in our guidance in our legislation as killing. And we don't use the term euthanasia. And why that's particularly important is, by definition, euthanasia is that it is the most humane method that you can use, and it's a good death. And fundamentally, it should be in the interest of the animal. And most reasons why we kill animals, whether it's agricultural purposes or for lab animal use, in some instances it's for their own interest, but in most it isn't. And therefore euthanasia by definition doesn't meet that criteria. And also quite often we won't necessarily be meeting the requirements of it being the most humane method available. And therefore, again, euthanasia would not apply. So I will refer to it as killing and not using the term euthanasia, because I think quite often, particularly when it comes to the general public and the acceptability of what we do, sometimes using terms like euthanasia, which some of the general public may refer, like, know more from what happens to their companion animals, is it suggests, it gives a level of security of, oh, well, it's euthanasia, so we're doing it for the animal's interest, we're doing a good death. And quite often I don't think we are actually meeting that. And so I think it's important to be very clear between those two definitions. So this slide is a bit horrendous and a bit messy, but I think it's a really important one to highlight the numbers and the scale of animals that this can involve. So on this slide here, you'll see there's lots of chicken icons, and there's actually 2,372 birds on this screen, and there are 48 pigs. And that is the number of birds and pigs that are slaughtered every second across the globe on average. So these are just the numbers of animals that we're talking about in the agricultural sector. So if we suddenly had to depopulate or do something, either in an individual country or an individual state or an individual city, the numbers are large. This is not a small number of animals that we're talking about. And we also need to think about this in terms of the ethics of depopulation and how we cope with it, that if we are building scale in terms of agriculture, in terms of intensification, the number of animals that we're housing in buildings, the number of animals we're having on a farm, we have to think about, if we were needing to depopulate those animals quickly, is there a limit of how big those farms can be before we're unable to humanely depopulate? And we should maybe be thinking about that in terms of our strategies earlier on. So I thought it would be quite good to go through some examples of depopulation that have happened both in the UK and the US and across Europe, to sort of highlight sort of different examples of how they happen. And this one here was a natural disaster, and it was actually a story I heard about when I went to the AVMA conference in 2020. So this was a fire that broke out in 2018 in Minnesota on a pig farm. And it resulted in 12,000 animals, piglets, all the way up to sows, having to be humanely killed as a result of this fire. Now, why this is such an important example to bring up is this disaster happened about 10 o'clock at night. And the vet that is assigned to this unit basically had to respond in an emergency of how she was going to deal with this and how she was going to sort of cope in this sort of disaster. So thinking about this, you've got some buildings on fire, you've got fire emergency services trying to deal with that. You've got smoke inhalation, you've got other buildings that are starting to collapse. So you've got injured animals, you've got animals with burns, and you've got animals that are smoke inhalation suffering. And you've got other animals that are trapped or you're unable to get to. And the other big thing here is the human health and safety side is you can't just wander in, you can't just sort of go into a disaster setting. So there's this delay that you have to be aware of on how you manage it. The other big thing with this was in terms of methods that are available for pigs, the office where the 2 captive bolts for this site were housed was actually between 2 of these sheds, and that was burnt down. So the captive bolts that were on site were not available for use, which means additional captive bolts had to be sought. But anybody who's used a captive bolt gun knows that you apply them individually. So that meant all those animals that had to be killed had to be individually had a captive bolt applied to them. So you've got to think about the number of cartridges used. And the other big thing is captive bolt guns overheat as they're used. So they basically have a shelf life as they're being used. And if you use them multiple times over and over again, you have to then rest them and allow them to cool down. But if you've got an emergency going on with animals being in pain and suffering, there's a lot of pressure there and making sure you've got the resources available to you. So this is an example of a natural disaster. It highlighted the animal welfare suffering that we have to be aware of, but it also really highlighted the human suffering because the trauma associated with having to depopulate on that setting resulted in the few vets that were emergency and came on site had severe mental health concerns afterwards because of the trauma involved. And there's actually a lot of research now showing that vets that have to deal with these types of crises end up with PTSD afterwards because it is incredibly traumatizing to do when you're trying to do your best in these situations. So the other example, which obviously many of us are all aware of, having gone through it not that long ago, was the COVID-19 pandemic. And this resulted in a large number of animals, both pigs and poultry and others, needing to be killed on farm. And that was across the UK, across Europe, across the US, across the globe. But why this was particularly a sort of different aspect to it is the main reason that these animals were being killed was not because the animals themselves were sick, but it was because the humans who were operating the processing plants were becoming unwell with this disease, which meant that they were not able to operate the processing plants. And this meant that pigs or poultry couldn't go to the processing units when they needed to, which meant they had to stay on farm. And because they stayed on farm, they then grew too big or they got larger, and the welfare concerns resulting in that. And we got this backlog of animals building up, which meant animals that were growing had nowhere to go to their next stage, and there was nowhere for the animals that were at the stage they needed to be to go on to processing. And there were millions of animals that needed to be dealt with in this scenario. And in this particular instance, why this was even more sort of difficult was, particularly in the case of pigs, is it further highlighted the lack of strategy across the globe that we have for depopulation strategies for pigs. We have very few methods available to us. And what that resulted in is certain methods being pushed forward that had serious animal welfare concerns and therefore also human welfare concerns as well. So this was sort of the latest one that we've been sort of dealing with. The other side to this is it basically led to emergency crises that countries had to respond to, is because there weren't depopulation strategies for pigs really on site, and pigs are, if you think about the different ways that they are housed across the globe, you've got outdoor systems, indoor systems, you've got piglets all the way up to sows, boars. The size difference in these animals and how to manage it became very, very challenging. And what that led to was this emergency response that meant methods that potentially, if planning had been in place beforehand, would not have been permitted or allowed to go ahead. And that included things like live burials, so where animals were just put into pits and then live buried because they had no way of doing it. And these were the types of incidences that were getting a lot of media attention from the public because obviously this was a huge outcry over what was going on. The other one that we are dealing with constantly now, because it continues and it's a rolling thing that we deal with every year, is highly pathogenic avian influenza. And that has basically been a sort of figurehead in terms of depopulation, of where depopulation strategies have actually started to be managed and planned in advance to deal with this. And that's quite an important thing that we take forward in it. But the key thing with this is this isn't going away. And, you know, this is a rolling crisis. So it's not, you know, this is not novel to us. So again, it's instead of basically waiting for the de-emergency to happen, we know it's going to be coming roughly on average, the numbers peak around winter, autumn time. So let's plan in advance of that. Let's get stocks and resources in place beforehand so that we can plan and have the strategy in place for the depopulation when we need it. So where this all kind of kicked off really in terms of sort of major depopulation events that got media attention and really brought this to the forefront for us as animal welfare scientists to be aware of was in the UK, which was the foot and mouth crisis of 2001. And these are some of the images of it here. And basically this disaster that happened where a large number of animals had to be killed because they were sick, but there were also animals that were in controlled zones who were healthy, who had to be killed to try and stop the transmission. And it devastated the UK farming industry. And what it highlighted was, in this instance, was how little prepared we were for a depopulation crisis. And it meant we had to learn as we went. And the main outcome from that is the veterinary community, the animal welfare scientists, the policy groups, everybody was like, we cannot allow this to repeat again. We should not, we've had our mistake, we've seen what can happen. We have to have strategies in place. And so the UK has been at the forefront across the globe of actually planning and having strategies for future depopulation events that may be required. And that's why from a poultry one, we've got the biggest arsenal of depopulation methods available to us that have been welfare assessed and considered high welfare. The other big thing that this crisis sort of highlighted was, and there was a lot of research afterwards, was the trauma it had on the human welfare. And I already mentioned that a little bit with the fire scenario, but there's been a lot of research showing the emotional turmoil that not only the vets who had to do a lot of the killing, but the farming industry, what they went through, having to see their animals being killed, and effectively the PTSD that was involved as a result of this. So even if you don't necessarily care about the animals and what happens to them, if you are providing them with a better death, you're actually also protecting the human welfare side, because these people who have to do these actions need to be protected and know that what they are doing has been thought through, is planned, and as high welfare as it can be. And that's incredibly important because it did lead to suicides. It did lead to a lot of harm. And so we need to protect both the animals, but also the humans alongside it. So the latest threat that we are sort of facing is African swine fever. And this map here shows the red dots are in wild pig populations, the blue dots are in commercial pig populations where outbreaks are happening. And this is throughout Europe. And we can see already in 2024, there's been over 1,500 reported outbreaks and 40 in domestic pigs. So particularly for the UK, where we haven't had it yet, the question is not an if we're going to get it, it's a when. So we need to be thinking now about how we will depopulate the animals when it's required, so that we're not doing an emergency panicked response, which could lead to lower welfare. And these tables here just show you the numbers, and you can basically see that they're increasing. And, you know, the 2024 figures are changing all the time and going up. So it's a constant growing threat that we need to be aware of. But that's just one of them. And this figure here, which is from the World Organization for Animal Health. So the key thing with this is that African swine fever is the latest one that we're aware of, but it's not going to be the only one. These things are going to continue to keep happening that we need to be aware of. And that's why future threats where we might need to use depopulation methods this is never going to go away. So we need to face this issue and have the strategies and the plans in place now and not wait for the disaster. And the key thing with this is 60% of pathogens that cause human diseases originate from domestic animals or wildlife. 75% of those emerging infectious diseases have an animal origin. And 80% of those pathogens that are of bioterrorism concern originate from animals. So if we're going to control some of the spread of these diseases that might be happening, we need to really think about how we would depopulate, whether that is killing the sick animals, but also controlling the spread by killing healthy animals. We need to have these strategies in place. So when it comes to depopulation and thinking about the animal welfare and the ethics side to it is these questions tend to get asked quite a lot. And that is, should the welfare standards required for emergency killing, which would include depopulation, be equivalent to what we would expect for routine slaughter? So when it's not an emergency, when it's normal procedure that's going on, and we have the standards applied in the law of how we would do it. But the questions often are, is that too high a standard to hold? Now, in my view, that is not the case, because if you have planning in place, you should be able to have the standards matched. Why we aren't able to do that most of the time is because the planning and the strategy isn't in place in advance. It's the emergency reactive response is what's happening. But we do need to think about things such as it may not be achievable if you've got inexperienced operators, you've got time pressure, you've got non-standardized conditions, and you need to protect human health. So a big thing with depopulation methods is, particularly if it's a disease outbreak situation that could potentially spread to humans, is quite often countries have time limits of when depopulations need to occur. So for example, if an animal is tested positive on a site, it would need to be depopulated within 24 hours or 48 hours. So that means, again, it's a ticking time bomb. You basically, as soon as that clock starts, you have to be able to roll out this depopulation strategy. So again, you've got to think about having the resources in stock, ready to go, held in advance, not panicking when suddenly you need to be able to do it. And that's what leads to certain methods being used, which are lower because the resources aren't there and in place. So in the EU, emergency plans are expected to achieve a humane death similar to slaughter, and that also includes the UK. That is the standard that we hold to, and it's very much about protecting the animal welfare during that process. And obviously, if it's an instant where animals are sick, then we are potentially by killing them, we are removing the symptoms that they are suffering. But there will be healthy animals as well that will need to be killed in exclusion zones. So you've got to think about the variety of animals you might be killing. You may have animals that are almost moribund, so severely sick, they're down, they're not able to get up, but then you'll have a bunch of healthy animals as well. So the methods that you have to think about have to be usable in a variable different conditions. And this comes into the sort of considerations you need to think about when it comes to depopulation methods. So they've got to be practical. So there is, I think the big thing around individual methods like captive bolt is if you've got to go to multiple farms and you're killing thousands upon thousands of animals and they're overheating, you're running out of cartridges, they're also a firearm effectively, which means you need to be trained in order to do it. There's health and safety practical things that you need to think about. So whenever we're designing these methods or thinking about them, they have to actually be applied and work in the real world situation. So there are constraints around that we have to think about. The other thing, as I talked about, particularly in a disease situation, they have to be available to be rapidly deployed because we have to respond quickly to stop the spread. So it can't be something that takes 2 weeks to get in place, but is then really high welfare. It's got to be ready to go when it is needed. The other big one is cost, and there's no way around this. This is just the way life is that we need to think about, is if you have a method that is incredibly expensive, like if you're using overdose of anesthetics or anything like that, and you have the cost become not copable for the organization, the government, whoever is paying out that money. And the other thing is how expensive it is in order to do those depopulation methods also means that the insurance premiums in certain countries that farmers adhere to in order to be covered when a depopulation event occurs would also be very, very high in order for the payments to be able to go back and forth and to cover those animals. You've also got to think, in the case of the disease one, is the transmission risk. So if you have methods that involve people having to be in close contact with these animals, then therefore you're increasing the risk of transmission. You've also, in cases of poultry, if you're thinking about highly pathogenic avian influenza, catching teams that go in to catch the birds, you're affecting their livelihood if they go into a facility where there is avian influenza, because they won't be allowed to go on to another site. They'll have to be clear for a certain number of days. So again, people might not be willing to go on to a site where they know there's a transmission of a disease that could risk them, but also could risk their work. And the other one, which obviously is the area that I focus on, which is the animal welfare consequences of the methods that we look at. And they are basically how we assess whether a method is humane or not. And I will come back to that later on in the talk. And the other big one, again, is the human welfare side, is that we have to think about methods that are in the best interest of people as well, not just from a human health point of view, but also in terms of how they're applied, how they're done to protect human welfare as best as possible. So we don't see the incidences of PTSD or suicides that we have seen previously. So when it comes to pigs and poultry, which are the two main species I'm focusing on as part of this talk, there are lots of challenges we need to think about. And the main one is the variety in how we keep them. So I've got different images up here, but for example, in the UK, nearly 60% of our pig herd is outdoor reared. So it's outdoors, they're not in sheds, they're not in barns. So that immediately means that affects how we might be able to do anything. You've got birds reared in floor systems like broilers. You've got birds, particularly if they're hens, in multi-tiered systems, enriched cages. Then you've got pigs that might be in an indoor system. You've got farrowing crates. You could have fully slatted systems. You could have straw-based systems. You could have freedom farrowing systems. All of these things, all these different housing environments have their own challenges of what type of depopulation method you could use. And so what I think the key thing here is we need to stop thinking there is going to be this golden bullet that is going to solve all problems, that there's going to be one depopulation method that can just be rolled out and is going to fix everything. It doesn't exist. When you've got this much variation in the systems that we have, what we need is an arsenal of different technologies for depopulation that allow us to cope with these variations, and in order to make sure the welfare is as best as it can be. So why this is critically important is because when a depopulation event is required, it has, from history, has shown what it results is a reactive response. And the development of ventilation shutdown in the US is the primary example of a reactive response, because there wasn't the planning in place in advance to deal with the disaster. And Wendy, who did the introduction, she and I authored a paper together, and this discussed the issues around ventilation shutdown and the ethics of it. But the issue with ventilation shutdown, and for those who don't know, basically what it involves is the animals being shut into their houses, the ventilation shut off and sealed, food and water withdrawn, which basically means that the temperature and the humidity in that space increases over time. Now, if it's ventilation shut down on its own, then it just means that the body heat from the animals and everything will just gradually increase it, and the animals will eventually succumb to heat stress and die. There's also ventilation shutdown plus, which is where you will add in additions like additional humidity. So they'll add in steamers to increase the temperature more quickly, or you may add in things like carbon dioxide to try and speed the process along. But fundamentally, the key thing with ventilation shutdown was there wasn't a depopulation strategy really available in the US that had that could be widely put out when it was needed for the COVID-19 pandemic or for the avian influenza pandemics that have been happening. So what happened was ventilation shutdown was put forward as well. We don't need to do anything because we're just shutting the animals in. It doesn't really require any additional resources. It doesn't involve people getting involved or trained operatives. We're basically just shutting the animals in and letting it heat up. So it was a low cost, easy, practical method that could be outlaid. But sadly, it had incredibly high animal welfare consequences, and it is a severe compromise to those animals. And the key thing with this method is if you use ventilation shutdown on its own and you don't have the plus involved, it can take days for the animals to die. And if you, particularly from the UK side, we have a big thing around, don't leave dogs in hot cars because of the pain and suffering that it can cause. It's effectively that over a longer period of time. These animals are dying from heat stress. It's painful. It causes a lot of emotional distress to the animals because of the dizziness, disorientation that they can experience. Also, you've got the added, because you're taking food and water away, that the normal coping mechanisms that they'll do to try and reduce their body temperatures, they're being frustrated that they can't have access to these things. If you add the plus in, it reduces the time down to hours, but this is not immediate. And hours is still where an animal is conscious and can experience negative animal welfare states. In the Europe and the UK is not permitted. It's not permitted to do this. In the UK, we have something called sort of an emergency measure where technically, if all other methods under our laws that we can use for depopulation, if they all couldn't be used, we were out of everything, then technically, if we then got special approval from the Home Secretary, we could use ventilation shutdown. It's never got close to that ever being needed. And we can't even do research on ventilation shutdown in the UK because it's considered so poor to animal welfare side of things. And so all the studies that have been done on it in the UK are actually just done from modelling. So just computer-based modelling to see what happens as the temperature of those animals rise. So this video here, which many of you have probably already seen, gives you a feel of what happens during this process. In this case, it's in pigs. The other big thing with ventilation shutdown is a depopulation method legally has to have 100% mortality. All the animals should be dead at the end of the process because that's what it's supposed to be doing. Ventilation shutdown is not that effective. So even at the end of those hours or those days, you will have animals still alive. So not only is it horrendous from an animal welfare point of view, it's not an effective method either. It's not efficient because animals are surviving and then they have to go through and have secondary methods applied. So this is taken from the paper that Gwendy and I co-authored, and it basically shows from a poultry point of view that between 2014 and 2016, when depopulation methods were needed, the primary method that was being used was airway occluding foams. That's low expansion foam. But then when you switch over to 2022, ventilation shutdown was, whether it was with CO2 or airway occluding foam or with heat, became the predominant of what was being used. So we saw this massive shift in the use of this method, despite the major animal welfare concerns with its use. So thinking about how we assess animal welfare during depopulation methods, because as a veterinary community, as veterinary techs, as animal welfare scientists, how do we know what is good in a depopulation and what is bad? How do we actually look at that? What is the science behind how we assess it? So I think it's really important to bring up our current sort of main theory that we have around animal welfare, and that we've moved on dramatically from the 5 freedoms or the that sort of very basic idea about what animal welfare was. And we now very much use the idea of the 5 domains model. And the key thing is animal welfare is it's a state within the animal. It's not something that we can give it. We can't give it something. This is what the animal's feeling at that point. And it basically involves the integrated outcome of what the animal is currently experiencing, and it's dynamic. It can change from second to second. It can change minutes to minutes. It can change hours to hours. It's not a constant fixed thing. And the 5 domains model, why this is sort of a bigger thing now is that originally very much animal welfare focused on the very physical or functional states. So you had things like nutrition, environment, health, and the behavior of the animal. The 5 domains model really highlighted the 5th domain, which is incredibly important for animal welfare, which is the mental domain. So what the animal experiences psychologically, what is the emotional impact that animal may experience, and all 5 of those domains have to integrate together to then give you the animal welfare status that it is. So when it comes to a good death, we have to think about what we want that to be. So we obviously want to avoid what negative experience that animal may have. So that could be things like pain or anxiety. And we also don't want it to involve things like fear and distress before, during, or during the administration of the killing agent. And the other thing we have to think about, particularly in the case of depopulation methods, is this isn't being done quietly in a lab environment with one animal. This is being done in front of other animals. So the method that's being used could be causing fear or panic in animals that are seeing what's happening, that aren't currently being exposed to it. So again, you've got to think about how these applications occur. And the big thing around depopulation methods, and also for controlled atmosphere stunning methods, so things like CO2 stunning, is it's not immediate. So it's not like captive bolt that as soon as the bolt's fired, that should be an immediate loss of consciousness and an immediate irreversible stun. These are not immediate. It can take seconds, it can take minutes, it can take hours in some instances, if it's depopulation, of what that animal may experience and go through. So it's, you have to think about what that animal is experiencing. And so when it comes to depopulation, there's lots of different things we need to think about in terms of what makes a good death or a good depopulation method. And so you've got to think of things around the environment, you've got the animal welfare concerns, you've got food safety and quality of whether or not there are issues that we need to go with how that moves forward in terms of biosecurity. You've got the human welfare and health side, which I've talked about. But the other big one now to be aware of is public perception. And so we all know what social media has done and the access that it is given the general public in terms of what goes on. Now, I don't think that's actually a negative. I think that, I'm very much that we shouldn't be worried if people were to see what we were to do on farm, if we actually were proud of what we were doing. If we were comfortable that what we were doing was the most humane method, then we shouldn't be worried about things being leaked out. Now, there is sometimes issues with misinformation or the general public not understanding a scenario, and therefore that's education, which is critical. But if we're worried about what the public are going to see because we are not confident in what we're doing, then that begs the ethical question straight away of, well, should we be doing it in the first place? And I think that's a real sort of big sort of highlight to go is, if some of the concerns about what methods we used is whether or not it's going to be leaked, whether or not a hidden video is going to be taken, asking the question of why does that matter? What are we not wanting to show? And why is that an issue for us? I think is incredibly important. So when it comes to animal welfare assessment, there are two big questions that we need to ask when it comes to a killing method like depopulation. The first is, how long does it take the animal to lose consciousness? And the second is, what are the affective states that are likely to be experienced up until that point? Because that's what's going to define the animal welfare status of that animal. And the other thing we need to think about is what happens to that animal before the killing procedure is enacted. Is there transport? Is there handling? Is there restraint? Anything like that? All of that adds into the animal welfare state the animal will experience. And then obviously we've also got to think about how long it takes for that animal to lose consciousness and then die. What's going on? What does that animal experience? And those are the key questions when we're assessing it. And there are multiple ways that we now do this in animal welfare science. And animal welfare science has blossomed dramatically in the last 30 years of how we look at this and really incorporating this 5 domains model. And so the big thing here is it's not about taking one method and looking at it. And I think it's about bringing in multiple methodologies to give us a clearer picture of what these animals experience. The big thing here is mortality is not a measure of animal welfare. So quite often studies that are looking at depopulation methods will report the mortality, how many animals died, whether or not it was effective. Yes, that gives you a measure of whether or not that method was effective. Did it result in those animals dying? But it gives you no concept of what the animal experienced. It has nothing to do with animal welfare. What we need to look at from an animal welfare point of view is, what does that animal experience before it died? That's the critical bit that we need to be aware of. And we have 5 approaches in the way that we do this, and it's how we put these together that allows us to give us a more objective understanding of the life experience of that animal in that process, and allow us to sort of assess different methods for depopulation. So behavior is sort of the critical one that we may look at, because it's not invasive, it's accessible, most people can do it, and it can be used in challenging environments like in a depopulation setting, and it's transferable. It's easily transferable to people who are trained to look for different behaviors. But there are limitations to behavior research, and that is simply because we don't understand the underlying motivational drive of why that animal is doing that behavior. We make assumptions. So if we label a behavior something like escape attempt or a withdrawal, we're putting a motivation behind that we're assuming. That's our subjective assumption that we're putting on behind that. We don't know the definite motivational drive behind that. And that is something we need to be aware of. And it's very important that then when you do behavioral ethograms, or you look at behaviors, is trying really hard not to add a subjective assumption associated with them, and look at it much more in a mechanistic way of just describing what the animal is doing, not assigning an assumed motivational drive alongside it. So key behaviours that we look at for depopulation to help us is to look at behaviours that help us get an idea of whether or not the animal's lost consciousness, and then whether or not it's dying. So key ones like that are loss of posture, which is the main one that is used, and it's a proxy for an early indication of loss of consciousness. So if the animal is unable to maintain its body posture, so it's fallen over and can't right itself, then it's an early indicator that the animal is losing consciousness because it's unable to maintain its posture. We've got other ones like abnormal breathing or ataxia, loss of balance. So that's before loss of posture, when they start swaying and going over. You've got convulsive activity, which is more assigned to where they've probably lost consciousness and it's closer to death-related behaviors. And then you've got things like sensation of breathing. So again, if they're not breathing, the animal's likely to be near dead. And it's these behaviors that are really important for us to get an idea of what an animal might be experiencing, but it's only giving us what the animal is performing in that situation. But why you have to be very careful in these instances is, what do we use these behaviors for? What does it mean? So if we use LOP, or loss of posture, as our proxy for when an animal loses consciousness, what that means is any behavior we see before that behavior occurs is likely to be happening when that animal is conscious. So the graph that is labeled A for carbon dioxide stunning, so this is pigs that were exposed to CO2, the red line that you can see is where loss of posture occurred, going across it. So that means all the black dots, all the behaviors of those black dots below that red line occurred before loss of posture. So we had things like facial grimaces, escape attempts, head shaking, ataxia, gasping, all of these sorts of things, head jerking, that are related to when an animal is conscious, and therefore might be useful for aversion-like behaviors or anxiety-linked behaviors. But we don't know which is which. We just know that these are behaviors that could be critical because it's before that point of loss of consciousness when derived from a behavior. But we have to be careful when just relying on behavior, and that's why using things like EEG alongside behavior is critically important. And so this graph here shows the latency to loss of posture on the x-axis, and then we've got the median frequency, so this is the electrical activity of the brain, on the y-axis. And basically, the dashed black line is what we would consider to be equivalent of a general anesthetic plane for a median frequency, which is about 6.8 hertz. So what this shows is for carbon dioxide, all the red dots, most of them are above that black dash line. This means that when the animal lost posture, so behaviorally couldn't stand up, its EEG data, its electrical activity of its brain, was showing that it was still able to experience its environment. It was not unconscious at that point, according to the electrical activity of its brain. So it might not have been able to stand, but it was still capable of experiencing its environment. So again, relying just on behavior is quite dangerous, because physically being unable to stand does not mean that the brain is not working, and we need to be aware of that. And other examples of where it's been really useful to use these different things is when we, the team and I that were involved in looking at low atmospheric pressure stunning in laps, is when we looked at it in the light and the dark for birds, normally it's conducted in the dark. And when we were looking at this, the brain activity, the electrical brain activity was showing the birds to be unconscious or showing sleep wave electrical brain activity before they'd lost posture. And we were like, what's going on there? This is really bizarre. So they were just sitting quietly, eyes closed, showing the slow wave EEG. So then we decided to switch it by putting it in the light because birds are very visual. And then that immediately made the EEG and the behavior data correlate beautifully. So basically what we showed is in the dark, when there's no visual stimuli going on for the bird, they were actually falling asleep in laps before they got to that point where the oxygen was too low. So again, from an aversion point of view, if an animal's falling asleep, it's unlikely it's experiencing negative sensations if it's able to go into that sleep-like state. But again, if we just relied on the behavior, we wouldn't have been aware of that. So using these multiple interventions is really critical. The other good thing is when you combine these is it helps you to understand if you've got the motivational drive or the assumed motivational drive wrong. So this graph here shows the EEG, which is the green squiggly line on top. And then I've marked with blue where specific behaviors happen for this individual animal. So you basically what we're seeing is as the EEG is changing, the electrical activity of the brain is changing over time. Now, the critical thing here is what you will see is we've got LOP happening at about 32 seconds. And then you've got the escape attempt happening after LOP, because that's what the behavior was described as. It was an escape attempt. The animal had basically done an explosive movement out of the crate to get away from that environment. That was our assumption. But it had lost posture already. And then we looked at the electrical activity of the brain. It showed that it was in an unconscious state. So therefore, that labeled behavior escape attempt can't be right because it was unconscious. And an escape attempt has to be a conscious, motivated behavior. So actually what that behavior was a rigorous righting reflex, an explosive movement, but did not mean that the animal was conscious at that point. So again, using both of these things at the same time is critical to understand what that animal experiences. The other thing that we can do is we can use interventions. So where we're trying to work out what a behavior means is we can use interventions like anxiolytics or anti-anxiety drugs or analgesics, pain relieving drugs, to see if changes in behavior with those drugs on board when exposed to these killing methods help us unpick what those behaviors mean. Are they pain related? Are they anxiety related? And therefore help us understand why an animal's doing something and then have a better understanding of the animal welfare state that the animal's in during these depopulation methods. So examples of this here, so we've got facial grimace and we've got head low. And again, this is in pigs being exposed to CO2 and laps. And what we can see is in laps for facial grimace, the anxiolytic actually reduced the number of facial grimaces that we saw. But then when you looked at head low, it was the analgesic that reduced that behavior. And facial grimace is a known behavior that's been used before. It's been well defined and validated after surgeries as a pain-related behavior. But in this instance, it was more around anxiety. Head low had not been looked at ever before in pigs, but because we had conducted the mechanistic approach to how we were assessing them, it meant we identified these key behaviors that we were never aware of that could be related to pain, and then allowed us to have a better picture of what the animal was experiencing. The other thing as well is you cannot transfer behaviors across species easily without checking that they're right. So in the case of pigs, which is the graph, what we can see here when they went through CO2, the number of head shakes were reduced by both the anxiolytic and the analgesic, suggesting that a head shake has probably a motivational ground around being anxious and being related to pain. But when you look for the same data in birds, head shaking increased when you gave them an analgesic. So it had the opposite effect. So using one behavior that you've identified in one species should not be just immediately transferred over to another, because species behave in different ways. They've got different evolutionary development of what they do in terms of behavior. So you can't just transfer them across. And other examples of this look at things like gasp or deep inhalations. We saw no analgesic effect in birds. We did see an analgesic effect when we looked at it in rodents, but we saw an anxiolytic effect when we looked at it in pigs. So these variations vary dramatically. We need to be aware of them and not just attribute across species and think they're all the same. The other big thing with these types of interventions is you've got to make sure that the drugs that you're using are actually effective, that they are pain relieving or anxiety relieving. So you can't just assume that they are. You have to make sure that they're validated and checked in the species that you're working with. Also the dosages that are required. And the other big one is if there's any side effects associated with them, particularly things like sedation, because if they sedate the animal, they may actually just be preventing the animal from doing those behaviors rather than actually having the analgesic or anxiolytic effect that they're supposed to be working towards. The other big thing that you can do is which allows you to sort of map back onto what you've looked at, is looking at the pathology. So at this point, the animal's already dead. This is when you're doing a post-mortem, but you can look at things like hemorrhaging or congestion of the tissues. And then that allows you to go back to see if there's certain behaviors that were linked to what we were seeing post-mortem that could help us understand. So in this case here, when we were looking at low atmospheric pressure stunning, we were looking at, this is slides of the eustachian tubes, so the eardrum effectively. And what we saw was that animals that were getting scores of 4 or 3, so we're showing most congestion and hemorrhage, were doing more ear scratching. And so that's linked across what those things are that we need to be aware of. So it's really important to sort of link all these together. And the last one is the newest thing that we do, which is behavioral paradigms. And this is where we are trying to assess the subject's mental experiences during a killing process. And we can do that by trying out different operant paradigm approaches. But the key thing with this is it requires a huge amount of training to do them. And so when we conducted these studies back in 2020, which we did as part of University of Glasgow with SIUC as well and University of Edinburgh, this took months of training to get these animals to learn the task that we were expecting them to do. And certain species you can train to do these things and other animals aren't necessarily going to do it. So with birds, you can train them to peck keys to get them to do things. And with pigs, the best thing that you can do is when you're training them to push a button is using rewards and things like that to get them to work out that if I push this button, these things happen. So basically an example of an operant is where we basically give the animal, we train them with a go, no-go model where pigs can either wait for a food reward or choose to leave the environment that they're in. So they're basically having to make the decision of, I don't mind being in this environment because I really want this food reward. The idea is if they really didn't like the environment they're in, it doesn't matter how much reward they might be getting in the future, they can choose to exit and leave. And that shows you an idea of magnitude of aversion, how much they don't want to be in that environment. And so this video here just gives you an idea of how you do the training if it plays. And so it's kind of a critical thing of how you bring, oh, it's not playing. Didn't work. We'll try that next time. But so the key thing with that is how the training worked. And so basically what that means is you're getting the animal to look at if it wants to leave. So if it pushes the button, it's saying it doesn't want to be there. It doesn't matter it's getting a treat, it's saying I don't want to be there. And so we can put it in environments where we either add carbon dioxide or reduce the oxygen with low atmospheric pressure stunning. And the animal will be basically telling us by pushing the button, I don't want to be here, I want to get out. So we're no longer relying on spontaneous behavior. We're relying on the animal giving us an idea of their motivational drive because they've learned a task that they're choosing to perform voluntarily to exit that environment. And that's the key thing of how we can do it. So they can either stay to wait for their reward, but you also have to be aware of is you might not get differences in the aversion responses like we did with the CO2 and LAPS, but that could be because they did find it aversive. They found both of them aversive, not necessarily one more than the other. They just didn't want to be in either of those environments. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that a method it should not be considered for killing. It just means you have to be aware that there are harms associated with it when they're occurring and how long for to think about the animal welfare state. So going back to sort of the big overview of where we are in terms of emergency killing methods and thinking about depopulation, this table here is taken from the paper that Gwendy and I co-authored. So it basically goes through the different methods that are available for pigs and poultry and gives you feasibility, practical constraints and biosecurity constraints, but also tells you what the potential negative affective states or what the animal might experience if you subject them to it. So the green ones are near immediate. So those are ones that are higher welfare. So the time that the animal might experience something is very, very reduced. And then as the table goes on, and it will go on to the next slide, that's when the time increases. I'm not going to go through all of these because it's very long, but I would highlight that you go to this paper and it gives you the summary of all of them, and it's a very helpful resource for anybody who's interested in this area. So the key thing here is as you go through this time period increases, and when you start using things like inhaled gases, so you're using a system where you're exposing the animal to a gas, it's not immediate. The time to loss of consciousness is elongated. Doesn't mean it's unnecessarily elongated, but it means you have to consider that the animal has periods where it will experience negative affective states. There are other methods that are permitted outside of the UK in the EU, for pigs particularly, things like sodium nitrate, low medium expansion foam, which I'll come back to, and ventilation shutdown or ventilation shutdown plus, which we've talked about. So the key thing here is the primary methods in the UK and the EU for pigs and poultry are containerized gassing units or mobile gas systems, so CGUs, or whole house gassing with CO2. But in North America, the primary method also includes ventilation shutdown, but that's not permitted in the EU or the UK. So if we've got to kill a large number of animals, we don't want a method that's going to have to be individually applied. It's time sensitive. We can't have something that's going to take ages. So using something like CGUs or whole house gassing alleviates that issue because it can be applied on a larger scale. But as we know from a lot of the literature that's been going around, particularly around the use of gases, CO2 is aversive to animals. It's painful to be exposed to CO2 and it's anxiety inducing in very low concentrations. And we've known this for a very long time. So these videos are courtesy of Mohan Raj from Bristol University, and this data was taken back in 1995. So this is not new information. So this video here shows a pig putting its head in to get some apples, so a really high valued reward for it, but that chamber is filled with CO2. So what you see is that the animal tries to get the apples at first, but then immediately withdraws its head, goes back because it's interested, it really wants the apples, but it will not willingly put its head back in after it's been initially exposed to the CO2. And that's the critical thing. It doesn't like it that much, it won't go back, even though it really wants those apples. Now, in comparison, if you do argon, which is an inert gas, same situation, the pig is being exposed to argon in the chamber now instead of CO2, and it's got its high reward. In this instance, the animal stays in the chamber for longer, it's eating its reward, it's happy, it's not seeming to detect what's happening, and it actually stays in there until it starts to lose posture. So it's losing consciousness because the oxygen's so low. But the critical thing with this is once it's regained its balance and it's got oxygen again because it's back in its normal environment, is it chooses to go back in. And the fact that the animal chooses to go back in means that that negative experience it might have had was not strong enough to deter it from going back to the reward. And so a big area that's now being looked at is how can we use inert gases instead of CO2 to take animal welfare a step higher? So something that's had a lot of interest for a while is the idea of using foam. And foam originally was developed in the UK as high expansion foam as a way to deliver gas when you were not able to seal the environment. So where you couldn't do whole house gassing and seal the environment to get the gas concentrations to be reached at what you required, it was a way to deliver the gas to the animals where you couldn't seal it. But there's actually different variations of foam that are available. So you have low expansion foam, medium expansion foam, and high expansion foam. Low and medium expansion foam is the equivalent of firefighting foam that is used in North America. It's not permitted in the UK, in the EU. And as Gwendy had said at the start, it primarily kills by drowning the animal, so it occludes the airway. And that was developed as an emergency killing method in 2006, and it was primarily done for poultry when it was developed. And it basically just means that you're effectively smothering the birds in this very watery foam, so it has a very high water content. and basically drowns the animal because they inhale the foam and then it blocks the airway and they can't breathe. And basically from the data, what we can see is it's still relatively quick if you compare it to something like ventilation shutdown. But we know from data that's been looked at in terms of animal welfare science, but also human welfare work, is drowning or blocking your airway causes a major panic-like state. And so the likely negative experiences that animal experience in that short period of time are probably very, very severe. And therefore, from an animal welfare point of view, is this the most humane method we can offer? Probably not. So high expansion nitrogen-filled foam is something that's been developed in Europe. And this is because occlusion of the airways, something that causes drowning, is not permitted. We cannot do that because of the severe welfare consequences. And we basically first started really being considered because we have concerns around shortages of CO2. So if we have to depopulate a large number of animals and we're running out of CO2, which has happened on occasion, then we need to have something else to use in our arsenal for depopulation methods. But the key thing with high expansion foam is that it is a dry foam. So it uses much less water and the bubbles that are created are larger. And the key thing here is the bubbles that are created are filled with nitrogen gas only. So it's 100% nitrogen gas. So there's no oxygen in it. And the way it works when it was designed initially in birds was that you basically cover the birds in this foam. And then as the bird gradually moves its head and does a little movement, is those bubbles pop right next to the animal's face because it's done a head movement. And then when that bubble pops, it releases the nitrogen gas immediately around its vicinity, causing 100% anoxic environment. So the animal is being killed by lack of oxygen and not from occluding the airway. So it's not inhaling the foam because it's a dry foam. It's not watery, which would then be smothering and causing them to drown. So there's been two studies that have looked at high expansion foam. And so the first one, as I said, was what was done in poultry, and that's when it was first designed. And this first started off with a paper done by Dorothy McKeegan at University of Glasgow with RVC and Live Tech Systems. And so they started off in the lab where they were doing it in individual birds, and they did it both in broilers, hens, turkeys, and ducks. And they did it with two gases in the bubble mixture. So they had CO2 and nitrogen. And they were doing it in controlled conditions to see whether it was effective, did it work at killing them, and then the animal welfare state associated with it. And then once it was shown that it had the potential, it was then taken forward for full-scale trials by DEFRA, so the UK government, and the UK poultry industry. So this is just some of the snapshots of the data that's shown here. And so what we can see is there's a control where we just filled the foam with air, so it wasn't going to cause anoxia. What you can see is there is a slight increase in heart rate when the foam starts. So when the bird is first exposed to the foam, they're a bit, the heart rate goes up. So there's a slight stress response. They're not sure what's going on. But when you expose them to nitrogen-filled foam, you do get that initial stress response and the heart rate increasing, but then you see this massive decline in their heart rate as they succumb to the anoxic environment. And then when you look at the electrical activity in the brain, what you can see here, which is suppressed EEG, so this is where it's loss of consciousness, is the time it takes in seconds for hens and broilers to lose consciousness. And the other thing to look at is the table below is the behaviours. So very few of these birds did any form of escape attempt. They didn't do head shaking, and they didn't do things like deep inhalation or gasping, suggesting again that occlusion of the airway is not happening. The other thing that was done was we did post-mortem afterwards. So again, if you're thinking about how we talked about all those different types of way we assess welfare, we then looked at the post-mortems afterwards because we wanted to check, are there any bubbles in the trachea of the animal or in the mouth or in the nasal cavity? Because if there was, that could be a sign that there was some occlusion. And the results were that there was no occlusion of the airway. So these animals were not swallowing the foam. It wasn't doing it. It was acting as it was supposed to and causing an anoxic environment around the animal, but not being swallowed by the animal. And so this was then taken forward into farm trials, so sort of real life situations of how it could be applied. And the important thing with this, again, was that the data that we were getting from the EEG and the behaviour were mapping up with what we saw in the lab. So it was consistently working even in a on-farm field situation. So it wasn't just a fluke in a lovely controlled laboratory situation. When you applied it in a bigger context, it was also working. And this is the level of systematic assessment we're doing before this depopulation method was even being considered. And so high expansion foam has been a potential method in the UK, and further research has been done. And actually, the Animal Welfare Committee of the UK government actually published an opinion piece on it in May 2024 of this year, and basically said that this method should be included as a depopulation method and considered high welfare, and should be added to the arsenal of what we have available to us. They also requested additional trials that were done. So basically, again, expanding what was being done. So they wanted to see what it was going to be, how it coped in different types of housing systems in terms of scale and largeness. So we did it in empty sheds as well as in sheds with live birds in it. This time it was broiler breeders. And again, what we showed was that the birds were minimally distressed. We did not get any smothering, birds smashing into each other to get away from the foam. They weren't doing that. And the birds were basically losing posture as soon as they were contacted by the foam, and that any birds that weren't in contact with the foam, so on the other side of the shed, were behaving normally. So it meant you could do this in sections, and that birds couldn't see what was happening to other birds because they were covered by foam, so it wasn't causing a panic as it was being conducted. So the key thing with this is we had EEG data, we had behavioural data, we had pathology data, and we tested it in multiple species and multiple scenarios. And that's where this method has now been taken forward and has been authorised for use in emergency disease control methods. It has now been taken forward in pigs, and there's a single paper now that's published in this for pigs, and that was done by the Swedish government. But there are issues around this paper. So I was part of the working group for EFSA, so the European Food Safety Authority, that reviewed some of this work. And so again, transferring across species is always a risk. So because it worked in poultry, and again, monogastric, pigs and poultry tend to get grouped together. Fundamentally, one is a bird and one is not. So we shouldn't just relay across these things. They are very, very different animals. So when pigs are exposed to foam, it did kill them. It was effective. And we saw sort of loss of consciousness based on behavior. So this was loss of posture only in around a minute. But unlike with the birds, we saw 80% of the pigs performing escape attempts, and 95% of them were doing high-pitched vocalizations, things like screaming or panic-related vocalizations. They also showed startle responses, and they also showed the elevated heart rate. So responded very differently to how the birds were reacting. The other issue with this is that we have no EEG data. So there's no data for the electrical activity of the brain to back up what we're seeing from the behavior, but also the minimal signs of aversion that we require for it to be used as a depopulation method are not currently evidenced based on this paper. And there was no pathology data to check whether or not the animal was swallowing or there was foam entering the trachea. And it was only tested in a small weight range of pigs. And because pigs can be piglets, where they can be tiny, versus a sow, the size of bubble is very important. And the reason for that is, if you imagine you've got the trachea of an animal, if the bubble sizes are small, it's easier for the bubbles to enter the trachea. So if you're using the same foam for a piglet, it may not be suitable for a sow, and that hasn't been looked at yet. So these are knowledge gaps that need to be explored. So as a result of this, EFSA and the team that I worked with, we published an opinion on this, and basically talked about the knowledge gaps and the limitations in the data that were there, particularly in the case of pigs. But it has been shown that it is equivalent in those instances to whole house gassing with CO2, because CO2 is aversive. So it's better than something that we have, but we need to take it a step further with pigs and do more validation of it. So in summary, because I'm aware of time, killing methods always need to have continued refinement. The job will never be done. Even if we come up with something we consider really humane tomorrow, in 5 years' time, as we learn more about animal welfare and how we can measure animal welfare, we should be looking for the next best thing. This job will never be done. And with animal welfare science continuing to blossom, it gives us a real opportunity to really look at the impacts of killing methods. Mortality is not the only thing that we should be looking at. It has nothing to do with animal welfare. We need to look at the effective states of that animal. And why that's so important is the ethical justification for use of animals in agriculture relies on, by law, us preventing unnecessary harms and minimizing necessary ones. and optimizing the net benefits of what we do. And the general public have a view on what they consider acceptable. So we have to make sure that what we're doing, how we're killing them, whether it's a routine slaughter or depopulation, is meeting the ethical requirements of what the public think, but also our own consciousness of what we feel is appropriate. And it's reasonable that society expects the highest standard in terms of welfare when it comes to killing, because quite often what's touted is that death is not a welfare issue, but that we're doing it for the animal's best interest. Well, we need to back that up by making sure that the killing methods are that high welfare. And the other big thing is we have a lot of knowledge gaps. We should not be transferring across species and all of these things because it's not reliable to do. And one method that works in one species may not work in another, or one method might not work in a different housing system. And that's why an arsenal of different methods is critically needed for depopulation. And lastly, we need to think about these things now and assess the methods now before the next disaster, so we don't have another reactive response, and methods like ventilation shutdown can get roots in to be then a permitted method to go forward. We need to have the strategies in place now in order to protect animal welfare. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take questions. I'm sorry if I've gone over time, Wendy.
Oh, no worries at all. That was such an excellent presentation. Thank you so much. Before we transition to the Q&A, I want to let our audience know how you can become involved in advocacy efforts on this issue. The American Veterinary Medical Association began publishing guidelines on animal depopulation in 2019, and these are used by the USDA and state agencies to guide depopulation for disease control. Earlier this month, the AVMA announced that a draft of a revised edition of these depopulation guidelines will soon be released for comment by AVMA members. So if you are an AVMA member, we encourage you to review the draft and consider submitting polite professional comments supported by science and well-reasoned ethical arguments to improve the document. VAFA will be providing feedback on the draft guidelines and making our recommendations available publicly. And if you're a VAFA member, you'll get emails, about these advocacy efforts in the future. So we're now going to shift over to the short question and answer period. I will try to get through as many of these as I can. I tried to kind of group similar questions together, but we had a lot of interest from our audience. Let's see, our first question for you, Dr. Martin, is how are the pigs depopulated in Europe with the African swine fever outbreak?
So that's a good question. So at the moment, the primary way that it would be done is probably by captive bolt. So the UK moved away from Europe, as we all know, and the trauma related with that. But which means in the UK we cannot use gas systems on farm to kill pigs. We don't have that under our legislation that's permissible. Now in the EU they technically could. But it hasn't been undertaken as a whole house gassing incident. So it's mainly been through captive bolt when it's needed to be done. And that's partly because there hasn't been a major depopulation required yet. And it's been small numbers.
Okay, yeah, so the numbers, so you can actually do individual methods.
Yeah.
Okay. And then this is one on, I suppose, EU or UK. Are there specific emergency planning requirements for producers? Or is everything kind of coordinated by the government, or is it producers who engage in the emergency planning?
So depopulation strategies are sort of tend to be derogated down to individual countries of how they manage them. There's not an EU law specifically of how it should be done. It's just whether or not a method is permitted or not. So in the UK government has, because after foot and mouth, they pushed forward with contingency planning. So in the case of poultry, for example, they have had, they've created a government contract with a company that basically has in stock all the time whole house gassing equipment, high expansion foam equipment, containerized gassing units, which are on emergency standby all year round. It's a rolling contract for high welfare methods to depopulate. So as soon as that call comes in, a farm's infected, they can roll out and they can be there within 12 hours. Now, obviously, there's a cost associated with that, but because of the financial damage that happens when AI happens from the producer side, is the producers all sign up through the farming levy boards for insurance, and so it means they can be covered, but they can only get their payback or their covering if they use permitted methods or use the government contract to depopulate. So again, it's about how these things work. So individual countries do it in their own way. I think quite often having government involved takes pressure off the producers. Producers are already financially on a knife edge. Like, farming is not a highly profitable business a lot of the time. So having to invest in their own system to have as a depopulation on site, I don't think is fair. And I think if you've got something from a government point of view, okay, the UK is a lot smaller than the United States, so it might be a statewide thing or whatever. But I think having it in that way where you've got these resources that are on hand all the time, that are available to all, and not just it's your own problem and you have to work it out.
Okay. Let's see, our next one, the audience member said this presentation has been extremely informative for poultry and swine with take-home lessons for all of us. Does Dr. Martin's group do research on cattle depopulation as well?
So I haven't done a lot of stuff on cattle. Again, a lot of this has been done after the foot and mouth situation, and there are the groups at University of Bristol in the UK and RVC, so the Royal Veterinary College. So you've got Andy Grist, Troy Gibson, and Steve Wootton, things like that, have done a lot of work, and a lot of that work's been funded by the Humane Slaughter Association in the UK, which is a charitable body that, if none of you've heard of, it's an amazing organisation, and you should look them up. But they fund a lot of work looking into this. But I haven't done a lot of work in cattle because most of my time has been taken up with pigs and poultry, and that's primarily because it's the biggest numbers of animals that it affects. In terms of numbers, cattle and sheep are just much lower than pigs and poultry. So I have to. I've worked with the bigger ones first, and then I might slowly work my way through.
Great. Now we've got a couple of questions about ventilation shutdown plus. I'm not sure if you'll know the answers, but do you happen to know what percentage of birds typically survive the initial application of ventilation shutdown plus?
So it varies, and also it's whether or not it's recorded properly, but some reported incidences have been anywhere between, the survive can be 20 to 0%. I think the average is nearer 5%. Sorry, that was my Labrador deciding to shake as I answered that question. Apologies for that. So it's nearer 5% is probably the average overall. But what we would expect for a depopulation method is it should be 100% mortality. There shouldn't be any survivors.
Right. And then another related question, I don't know if you'll know the cost of this because it certainly could vary between countries, but how would the cost of high expansion nitrogen foam used on, say, a 10,000 bird indoor flock compare with other methods like carbon dioxide or ventilation shutdown plus?
I can't answer that question because I focus on the animal welfare side, but I know for the UK, there isn't a cost difference because it's just part of the contract for rolling out. So it's more about the site is assessed for what is the most appropriate method to use. So if it's a shed that can't be sealed, then foam would be used, high expansion foam would be used. If it's a building that could be sealed, and there are other issues that, for example, high expansion foam hasn't been tested in colony cages or enriched cages that we have here, because it hasn't been seen whether the foam can get in around the cage furniture, then foam would not be used in that instance, and instead whole house gassing would be used. So it's not to do with cost, it's more about what's practical to apply in those situations and assessing it from a welfare point of view, because the cost is separated from it and it's not on the producer or the farmer to lay out those costs.
Okay. I'm going to skip the next question because it also related to costs of different methods, and I think that's not your area, but we are hoping eventually to have some speakers who are working more on the ground with farms and might be able to speak to that. So stay tuned. Let's see, then switching gears a little bit, somebody is asking not about depopulation, but when it comes to stunning and slaughter methods, if you have your own, if you had to recommend the sort of higher welfare, highest welfare methods of stunning and slaughter for different species, what would they be?
Oh, blind, that's a whole other talk. So, well, I think the big thing for me is controlled atmosphere stunning with carbon dioxide. In my personal opinion, for pigs, is not humane. It is highly aversive, and I am not comfortable that that method is used. And we have known that for a long time, and we need to, I think there needs to be a real push now that it's just banned in law. The excuses around that there aren't alternatives available yet isn't the case. We know from the work done in inert gases that there are alternatives. Yes, there's technological sort of things we have to overcome in terms of changing how we might operate our controlled gas systems, but they are not insurmountable. And so a bit of money and investment from the industry to solve those problems is not a reason not to move away from CO2. When it comes to birds, the primary methods we've got are obviously electrical stunning, so water bath stunning versus carbon dioxide stunning, or a mixture of carbon dioxide and inert gas in a CAS system, or LAPS. LAPS has been shown to, so low atmospheric pressure stunning, I should say, rather than LAPS, is shown to be equivalent when using inert gases only, so considered very high welfare. So for me, LAPS for birds has been shown to be the most humane, but birds react quite differently to CO2. And because the water bath stunning that we do, or is used, has such severe welfare compromises because the birds are shackled upside down while conscious, and that causes pain on their legs and issues like that. You've also got real issues with pre-stun shocks if they don't go into the water bath properly. There's a lot of issues with water bath stunning. So if you were to rank them, I would have like LAPS, CO2 gas stunning, and then I would have electrical water bath right at the bottom. I can't go through all the species. I'll be here all day.
No, that sounds good. And then here I'm rephrasing this question a little bit, but one viewer is asking about how you manage ethical challenges associated with performing this type of research. For example, your ultimate goal obviously is to encourage the adoption of more humane slaughter methods or other killing methods. But to do this, you must do research that causes fear and distress to the animal subjects. How do you handle that?
So it's really hard, is the answer. So what I would say is there's actually very few of us across the globe that work in this area, and it's referred to as the sharp edge of animal welfare. And the ethical argument is one of the main things that we do to animals, and whether or not you ethically agree with that, and I know a number of people don't, we kill them. It's one of the main things we do to animals. And whether or not you agree with that is a separate issue. What I am focused on is, if that is going to happen, I want to make sure that how it is done is the most humane way possible so that the least amount of harm is done. And in order to do that, you need to be able to do research on a very small number of animals in comparison, so that the millions or billions, in the case of poultry, 72 billion are slaughtered every year, is done as a humane method as possible. So that very small number of animals that you do research on means you are helping a much larger proportion of them. But what I will say is any research that we do is very much about something has to have the benefit in order to do it. So any research that we do is not to confirm something isn't good, it's to look to see if something is better. It's about finding the potential for something future and refining it. So if we know something isn't great, we won't repeat it. And so, for example, like in the UK, like I said about ventilation shutdown, before we do animal studies, we quite often have to do modelling where there's no animals involved. We're just looking at the theory behind it. If that has shown that it's going to potentially be really horrendous, we're not able to take it into animal studies. So ventilation shutdown studies in live animals has not been permitted in the UK because the modelling with no live animals showed how horrendous it would be and how long it would take. And so that was enough for the government to go, right, well, it's then not on the cards. Like, we're not even considering it, and we haven't been able to do live animal research on it as a result. And I don't, nobody would want to, is fundamentally the point, because we've got other methods that are there. We don't need to prove that it's horrendous. We can gather that from the modeling that's been done, and we have methods that are better. So there are limits to what you would do, but when you have to do this research, the benefit is about helping the much larger number of animals, because whether or not I choose to eat meat, or whether or not I'm happy that we kill animals, which is separate, that's my own moral, ethical view, it's going to happen. And I care about those animals that are being subjected to that. And so I have devoted my career to ensuring that those methods that are used are as high welfare as possible. And we are constantly challenging that question. I want there to be new methods looked at every year. I want there to be new inventions, because then we're constantly making that line better.
Great, thank you for taking the time. That was a tough question, and we really appreciate your answer. Let's see, there are a few more that have come through here. One person is asking about your first example of the fire emergency. What would you recommend be used? And do you think there really is a size limit in terms of the number of animals that farms should be? So I guess two different questions. What method for the fire scenario? And then is there sort of a limit on how big farms can be? Because beyond that, it can become too difficult to enact higher welfare methods of depopulation.
Yeah. So the key thing is, when that situation occurred, there wasn't a strategy for depopulation of pigs, and there wasn't in the EU either. So captive bolt was all that we had, and captive bolt, in terms of on the individual, is higher welfare. The difficulty is you can't just say what this method in this situation, it all depends. So in that instance, you had some buildings that were on fire, you had some that were just smoke damaged and had smoke inhalation, you had some animals that were suffering from smoke inhalation but weren't injured, you had some buildings that had collapsed, the roof had gone down. So it may be that you would have used different methods for different areas of that site. So it could have been, again, more research is needed, but potentially that's where high expansion foam, for one where the roof had come down, may have been a potential, but more research needs to be done. And then you've got other ones that can, you used a whole house gassing instance, or if you've got instances where you could get to the animals, is you could take the animals out of the building and you could have put them in containerized gassing units or captive bolts individually on the side. There's lots of different ways that it could have been done. The challenge is we don't know the right solution yet, because we haven't planned it. And I can't tell you the right answer yet, because what actually needs to happen is the stakeholders coming together and sitting down over a table going, right, in this situation, this has happened, what are we going to do? What happened as a result of that fire was planning afterwards of not having the two captive bolts in the office next to one shed, having them across multiple areas on the site, having backup ones, having, there's all of these things that you think about afterwards that you can do to help.
Right. And did you want
to remind me what the second question was?
Whether there is farm size should be limited in terms of the number of animals in a location because of the inherent difficulties of managing emergency situations if they're, just beyond a certain size.
Yeah, so again, this is it's a difficult question. There's not a perfect answer. So instead of there being a cap on the size, what I actually think is any new housing, when it's being designed or built, should have to submit a depopulation plan with its building. So I don't care if it's got 10,000 animals in it or 20,000 animals. I just want to know that a plan is in place to how to depopulate it. The number itself isn't important. It's the planning of what you would do if this scenario happened. So, for instance, at the moment, we have, for broilers that are floor reared, you could have high expansion nitrogen filled foam, you could have whole house gassing, you could have containerized gassing units. But for enriched cages or colony cages or, laying hen systems when they're in cages, foam is not an option. So that means you have to have whole house gassing. So if you have a shed that's really old, where you can't shut the ventilation down, you can't seal it, which means whole house gassing won't work, what are you going to do? does that mean that that farm should have to invest in improving its ventilation system so that it can seal the building up, so that it has a method to depopulate? It's thinking about it more like that rather than the number of animals. And that's more how I would think about it in terms of depopulation. There's another question about how many animals you have and how do you check all the animals on a daily animal welfare inspection and what's too many. That's separate. But from a depopulation point of view, it's more about the planning with the building design.
So many more questions have come in since we started talking, but I think we've reached that half-hour mark, so we probably need to sign off here in just a moment. I think you did have in your presentation your contact information if a researcher or veterinarian or somebody interested in this topic wants to follow up with you further, and we'll keep track of the questions. If there's something VAFA can help answer for our members, we can reach out to you via email as well. Just wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for this excellent presentation, and for everyone who attended this important and timely webinar. And in case anyone has colleagues who are interested in this topic but couldn't attend, we will be posting a recording on VAFA's website. And as we sign off, we just would like to ask a favor of our audience, which is to please fill out the evaluation form that you will be receiving by email. This is just essential for allowing us to get to know our webinar participants and VAFA members, and to give us ideas for future webinars you'd like to see. And finally, if you're not already a VAFA member, please consider joining. The first year of membership is free, and if you have any questions, just email us at info@vafaw.org. Thank you.